Hi and welcome to this week's Mailbox. It's actually take 2 because I had my microphone muted for take 1. So what's been happening in the last week? Of course, we've had Blizzard doing their Q&A. Yes, we all know, someone said that was just really marketing for the BfA pre-order. So we've got a load of information about when it's out, but we still only know so much about it. We haven't really had added to it our great sum of knowledge from BlizzCon. But, of course, it brought with it the allied races, again, earlier than some people were expecting, myself included. So a lot of the questions and comments have been largely around that. So on to the first one. It says, do you think with the talents, they'll finally just go, talent A is for open world, leveling content, talent B is for dungeons, talent C is very clearly a raid option. It may homogenise everyone, but balance has already been proven an impossibility, so why not make very clearly defined choices? No, they will absolutely not do that. It really doesn't matter whether, you can argue whether or not they should do that. I would argue, not so much along those lines, but I would argue if you've got a talent row that modifies a particular ability, that you should think in terms of, okay, do it this way, and that's going to make you good at single target, this way better for AoE, this way better for a bit of a mix, or something else funky that happens. Generally speaking, I think you'll find the people who play a class for which there's only one DPS spec will certainly agree with that. The people who have access to other ones may not, but then that's because they know they can just switch whole specs to specialise between different types of encounter. But we know Blizzard are not going to do that, so there's no point in going down that rabbit hole, really, because they have said they stick to their idea that talents are a choice. That you can just go along one day and you go, do you know what, tonight I fancy using this talent. The problem is that never happens, and there's a reason that never happens, exemplified by this clip. Well, I say a clip. I think this is supposedly what Asmongold said in his stream about it. Someone just basically produced a clip of it here. It says, we look forward to seeing the combinations that you put together, from Blizzard in other words. And Asmongold's response apparently was, I look forward to reading the best one on Simulation Craft as well. Because that's what's going to happen. The closest thing Blizzard have done in terms of trying to move towards a more choice-orientated talent system in Legion, in actual fact, all they've done is confused a lot of people, because now what happens, it used to be the case, if you're going to do a particular fight, you would use this talent. We actually used to, before they adopted this philosophy, we used to vary our talents a lot more than we do now. And certainly I do. I don't change my talents at all, really. To the point where every now and then when I do, just for whatever reason, I then forget to change it back. It takes me because I'm not used to it at all. I'm used to having the same talent for every raid fight, for every dungeon, for my solo stuff. It just doesn't change. It almost never changes. In terms of the damage ones, it doesn't change at all. So, what that you have is this situation where they insist that it should just be a choice, but in reality, people who play it serious, obviously without something like that, yeah, there is variation. There is some variation. When I first dig it out, and I don't know how to play it, I mean, I generally go for the passive options for talents, because that's easiest. I don't have to learn new things. Then when I get more comfortable with the overall spec, then I'll switch to more active ones maybe, if I think they're going to be a bit better. But even then, I mean, I was playing my Warlock in a few fights. I don't change my talents from fight to fight. I don't think to myself, okay, which talent should I use? Oh, well, this fight's mostly single targets, so I'll use these. Oh, this fight's got loads of ads. I'll know I'll switch to this. I just don't, because I'm not playing it seriously. But if it was my main and I need to play it seriously, then I need to think, okay, I'm going to need to use which is best for that fight. Now, sometimes what they've done is, depending on your gear or depending on your specific role, because you can have two people playing the same class and the same spec on the same fight, but two slightly different jobs, that might mean slightly different talents used. That's the nearest it's come. But the problem with that is you then just end up with a situation where people are asking on Discords or wherever, forums, okay, which talent should I use on this fight? And the response then has to come, well, most people are using these ones, but you really should just submit for yourself. Which is not very helpful to those people because, they want to just be told. But what this has done is created a situation where you can't always be told. But there is absolutely no situation where, let's say, a top player of their class or spec is ever going to say, do you know what, tonight I fancy using this talent. That just doesn't happen. Because there's always the best one to use. You might experiment. You might think to yourself, okay, well, with the time in which we're killing this boss now, maybe this would be a better talent. And you try it out, and if it seems to work out all right, you stick with that. And if it doesn't, then you go, oh, no, I'll just go back to the original. But you never make a decision just based on what you're feeling like, which is what Blizzard seem to want. But it's just not practical. But anyway, on to the next one. It says, I am against how Blizzard is thinking with classes and races that don't match. How can you explain monks? Seriously, every single race can be a monk, and that doesn't make sense to me. The law reason is that the trainers go out and train people. Why can't all other classes do the same? Well, if they wrote that into the law, then of course they could. Absolutely. I mean, there's a very big difference with World of Warcraft and a lot of other MMOs. And other MMOs tend to be by game designers who don't own their own world. They get out a license for it. So Lord of the Rings Online, very clearly. You know, the other ones, Age of Conan, Warhammer Online, Star Wars, The Old Republic, blah, 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 blah. And they can embellish it. They can create their own stories in there. But they can't really contradict what is the stated facts of that world. Blizzard can. Blizzard can completely contradict themselves at a whim. They can, you know, we call it retconning, because they own everything. They own their own world, their own characters, their own everything, so they can do what they like. So they absolutely could write in that, yes, if it's just a case of training, that people could do that. And you come on to this next point here. It says, don't you think that now, since we have class order halls represented and established, isn't it time for those halls to start open recruitment and getting more races into it? Again, they could easily write that in and it would make perfect sense. But that's not what they want to do, because the fact of the matter is, if we're going to World of Warcraft, I've said it before and I'll say it again, is a very, you know, in as friendly terms as I can say it, a very racist game. You know, it has this idea that each race has its own particular cultural or behavioural model, and they stick very rigidly to it, which is always the argument for why they don't allow a neutral faction, even though in the storyline they exist anyway. We have neutral factions. We have organisations, large organisations, powerful organisations that have mixtures of Horde and Alliance races in it. But they just pretend those don't exist for the game purposes. But I'm just going to skip right ahead to your last point here, because I am actually going to back Blizzard up on this one. So you say here, Draenei and Tauren can be a calm and steady to becoming a monk, but cannot be a rogue. That is nonsense in my opinion. See, the thing is, you're associating, with monks, you're associating the idea of discipline. Okay, fine. And you're associating the same traits with rogue. No. The overriding trait of a rogue, when you think about a rogue, what is the overriding attribute of a rogue? There are many that you could say, and discipline can be one of them. But the overriding attribute is sneakiness. They are sneaky. I can't think of anything less sneaky than a Tauren, if I'm honest. And a male Draenei as well. Or in fact, even a female Draenei with, in fact, both races with the clippity-cloppity of hooves, they're going to have a tough time sneaking up on you. Quite frankly, I think they're pushing it with orc rogues. I'm not really buying the idea of orc rogues. But the idea of clippity-clop, sneaking up on you, no. And as for Tauren, male Tauren and Draenei, when it comes to it, the idea of them sneaking around, even if they were somehow to, you know, put a load of felt over the bottom of their hooves, no. So I think that's the issue there. But yeah, of course, if they wanted to do it, they could easily write it in. They can write anything to the storyline. Like I sometimes get triggered by, you know, I talk about Tauren Paladins shouldn't really be a thing, and then go, no, they explained it all with this Sunwalker thing. No, they didn't explain it. They just wrote something in. And we have to buy it because it's their game. They can write in whatever they want. Okay, and that's all there is to it. They can write whatever they want, and it's there because they're not, you know, they're not having to license the world from another company or an author or anything like that. It's all their stuff. So, on to the next one. Now, this is one where I was talking about, again, this is a common theme that came up because I'm very pro-neutral factions for PvE, not for PvP. You know, any arguments that are to do with, okay, World of Warcraft is about Alliance versus Horde, that's fine for PvP, but it makes no sense for PvE because there hasn't been a single storyline in the whole of World of Warcraft that is Alliance versus Horde. Not one. All right? They say there are going to be some in Battle for Azeroth. It still remains to be seen, but there hasn't been a single one before this point. The closest we ever got to it, the absolute closest, was a brief cameo in a couple of bits of Wrath of the Lich King where you had the gunship. That was one part of one raid, one single encounter. And even then, the encounter was exactly the same. What did we end up doing? You know, we end up getting off and still fighting an orc either way. Anyway, so, you know, and then we have Alliance versus Horde Rumble in Trial of the Grand Crusade, or whatever the hell that raid was called. But every storyline has basically been Alliance working with the Horde. Even if it's not directly working with them, sometimes it's like your common enemy, but you're still both working to the same goal. But very often in raids, you are working together. On Archimond, we had Alliance and Horde working together. You know, even in Icecrown Citadel we did, really. There's been plenty of raids where you've had powerful champions of the Alliance and the Horde together helping you out. So, yeah. But then the coming to the comment here, it says, you seem to forget the champions of Azeroth are not the only people that populate the world. The factions still harbour hatred for one another. Well, who says? They've both spilled the blood of their family and friends. The citizens of Stormwind still remember the atrocities of the Horde when they sacked the city twice, for example. Do they? Why do they? If I was to go around and ask the average American to tell me something about the Korean War, for example, would they be able to tell me very much about it? Not very likely. And the period of time that has existed since the Korean War is very much the period of time that has existed since the second sacking of Stormwind, effectively. Or the Second War. That's the same period of time. Why would they... You know, it'll be in their consciousness. They'll be aware that it happened. There may even be some survivors from it. But they'll be quite old now. There's not many. So, actually, the population will have... Do you know what? Even the ones who do remember it, passage of time and all the rest of it, yeah, not really. Not really at all. And then there's another comment as well from someone which I agree with as well, which also, and these are more recent events, says these ideological differences are unsurmountable. Really? Does it just not matter that Velen reignited the Sunwell? So again, there you've got Alliance character doing something nice for a Horde race. Does it just not matter that the Thrall, the founder of the Horde, led the charge against Deathwing? Again, yeah. And these are more recent events. This is where we worked together with the guy who set up the Horde. Or the Horde as we know it now. Obviously, there's a difference between the Orcish Horde that invaded Azeroth and the Horde as it exists now. There are ideological differences, and they'll likely always exist, but they hardly mean people are going to forget all the times that they got helped out by members of the other faction. Nor are we going to forget the heroes who are dear to us both. These things matter far more. And actually, I would go further, and I would say, when these people have been instrumental in saving the whole world, which we seem to have done quite a few times now, that's surely going to be quite hard to forget. You know, so the idea you'd have hatred for people who've saved your lives is a bit mad. You know, it's a bit like one of these things. Do you have hatred for a group of people who killed your grandfather, but that saved your life? Especially when it's not even the same people, because the people on both sides are largely dead. I mean, war and time has done that for most. So, yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. There is no storyline sensibility for me in not having neutral faction. It's just simply Blizzard don't want to do it. And it's their game. But that's what it comes down to. It don't come down to it because it makes sense or not makes sense. It comes down to it because they just don't want to. It costs them players. We know it costs them players because as any number of players stop playing because they're not able to, say, find a guild without having to spend a load of money on transfers and stuff like that. So, you know, they just stop playing, things like that. But that's, you know, that's the sacrifice they're willing to take to make the game they want. And you know, in many ways they should, if they have principles, if they say, and they did, at the interview with Forbes, they laid out very clearly the whole concept of Alliance versus Horde is the very centerpiece of World of Warcraft. They said that, which means, you know, that's okay, that's that decision made. Even though it doesn't seem consistent with what they've actually done. But they've made the decision. It also ought to be borne in mind that, you know, we're getting ready for Battle for Azeroth and it's been billed as a very much faction v faction expansion. They said the same at the end of MoP. At the end of MoP, they sort of said, okay, you know, there's this bit of spirit of cooperation right at the end of it, but then we need to start kicking it off again in the next expansion. And they didn't. They didn't. So how much they actually will in the next expansion remains to be seen. On to the next one. Yeah, it says this was again based on the Forbes interview. It says, it really feels like they've said something like, yeah, you've killed titans and gods and whatever else, and while we've not run out of things for you to raid yet, we're pretty close. So suddenly millions of player characters of the opposing faction are the gods for you to slay. Isn't it wonderful? It could, yeah, you could actually read that into it. When, you know, the Burning Legion was completely defeated, which was a surprise to me that they actually went that far. I, remember thinking, this could be quite a good thing because it forces them to come out with new lore now. Because we've defeated everything that they keep regurgitating. They keep regurgitating the same baddies and stuff like that and villains for us to fight. Well, we've killed them off. So they're forced to give us something new now. Old gods would be an obvious thing there because although old gods have been in the lore for a very, very long time, they haven't really been in the game that much. They weren't really in the Warcraft games, the RTSs, to any serious degree. And they haven't been in that much in World of Warcraft even. There was a bit, I mean, Cataclysm more than most. I mean, that was, if there was such a thing as an Old Gods expansion, that was it. And even then it was largely Deathwing, really, that was the, obviously he was corrupted by the Old Gods, but he was the key figure still, who is not himself an Old God. So, and we could have had a couple like Cthulhu in Vanilla and Yogg-Saron in Wrath as well. So, they have been there, but they haven't really explored them in storyline-wise in a way that maybe I thought they would in the next expansion, where it doesn't look like they will. Maybe there'll be a tier based on something, and Zoth maybe, but that's about it. But yes, you could also read into this. Maybe that's not what they're intending. Maybe they are thinking to themselves, oh crap, we've run out of stuff. And then some bright spark at the meeting goes literally like they said here, I know, everyone's so really powerful now, we've killed gods and demons. Why don't they just realise that actually there's equally powerful people on the Horde and the Alliance? They can turn on each other. That would be epic, wouldn't it? And they've all gone, oh yeah, good idea. It could literally be like that. It literally could be like that. So, on to the next one. It says, I disagree with your points about the class orders and the faction divide and how we can't be part of that neutral faction. Which is a very strange thing to say because I didn't say that. In fact, I said, as I have done for quite a long time now, I would like the neutral faction. So I'm not really sure how... The only way I'm saying it can't happen is not because it can't happen storyline-wise, because it's the opposite. It's because Blizzard say they don't want it to happen. That's why it can't happen, if you've heard me say that. But anyway, they've said here, the Horde and the Alliance are more than just the classes on the right of the character screen. They're the foot soldiers, SI7 and other parts of the two factions. Where our classes and heroes come together in Legion, there was major friction between the Horde and the Alliance. Behind the scenes with Gen, Sylvanas, the Towers and other cut content, blah, blah, blah. When the Legion threat ended, these frictions came to the forefront and classes and heroes are getting dragged in. I like this because it gives a World War sense in that the war is so all-encompassing that everyone is getting dragged in whether they like it or not. And Blizzard has said that there will be a storyline with Magni and Khadgar trying to sort out the World Soul, which could be where heroes of the Horde and the Alliance finally find common ground with their factions backs as they fight, blah, blah, blah. Well, again, the thing is, yes, this Horde and Alliance friction that's been going through Legion basically just backs up my point that a neutral faction for players would make more sense. Because who fought everything in the Legion? It wasn't the Alliance and it wasn't the Horde. It wasn't even the Alliance and the Horde teaming up. It was the Order Hulls. That was what it was supposed to be. These were the protagonists in Legion, the Order Hulls. Blizzard kept saying time and time again that when you go to the Broken Shore, it won't be the Alliance going and it won't be the Horde going. It will be the Orders, the class Orders that will be going, with you as the leader of one of them. And that's exactly it. And this is what I've been saying. Legion has basically been the expansion where effectively in storyline terms, more so than any other expansion, there was a neutral faction and we were part of it. It's just that gameplay-wise it wasn't reflected, that's all. And now they're wanting to move it to the completely the opposite end of the spectrum. They're completely contradicting all of that work in Battle for Azeroth is seemingly how they want to do it. And you say here about Magni and Khadgar finally find common ground with their factions. We find common ground all the time. Every single raid tier, we've found common ground. Because you have Horde and Alliance. Out of gameplay necessity, they have to design the same raids for us. even given that they've said there might be the odd faction-specific boss in the next expansion, it'll still be the same raids and it'll still be the same fights. There'll just be a different face on it. So, because they can't design a raid that only can be done by Alliance, and they can't design a raid that can only be done by Horde. For two reasons. First of all, people wouldn't wear it. And second of all, you'd have Blizzard themselves don't want, they've already said they don't want to be making content, because they did a bit of it in Legion and they regretted it. They don't want to be making content that's only accessible by some of the player base. So yeah, it comes back to the thing I was saying right at the start of this video on talents. If I was to have a theme to this week's mailbox, it's inconsistency. It's the philosophy is inconsistent with the reality. And the same with storyline. And storyline should be easy. It should be easy to make the storyline consistent with reality because you make it up. You decide. It's not based on player behavior. Like talents is based on player behavior. I'm sure Blizzard would love it if people used a magic 8-ball to decide their talents from night to night or session to session. But they don't, because we behave in the way that we want to behave, and we behave in the way that is, right, this is the best talent, we're going to use that. Whereas storyline has got nothing to do with our behaviour, it's entirely to do with how they write it. And yet they still can't make it consistent with the gameplay. Huh? I mean, at this point, after this many years, and you can't do it, I'd be instead of thinking, right, let's make an expansion where we really go for it, I'd be thinking to myself, do you know what? Should we rethink our hypothesis here? Because that's what you were doing for a scientific investigation. At this point, you'd be thinking, maybe we should rethink our hypothesis. But they don't. Next one. So I don't like the idea of having allied races and more racials. Blizzard obviously can't balance the current ones. It's nonsense. I'd rather have a reworked racial system and sub-races. Indeed, so would I. In fact, sub-races did, which they're not, they're allied races, as they call them. Although some people have pointed out, well, they use the same animations as other ones, like Void Elves with Blood Elves, stuff like that. So are they not more sub-races anyway? I still sort of see them as sub-races. But in terms of the racials, yeah, anyone who watches this channel knows that I'm not a fan of racials that affect gameplay because it creates that sense of I should play this particular race because the racials are really powerful. I don't particularly like that aspect. With actual sub-races, if they'd have just gone with it and made them sub-races, it could have been quite interesting. So, for example, as people have pointed out, Void Elves are basically just, they're using the same models and animations effectively as Blood Elves. Well, why didn't they just share the same racials? They could have called them something different. Instead of Arcane Torrent, it could have been Void Blast or something. But if they'd have basically had the same basic racials, then you create a situation where you have a class that can have the same racials for Horde and Alliance. Now, okay, if you were to follow it and really properly balance it out, all right, sure, you're going to also have to have them having the same class choices, which obviously can't be the case in that situation. But, it would have potentially allowed you certainly wouldn't want a situation where you're just creating whole new racials for them, which is what they've done, and some of them are quite powerful. I don't want to blow it out of proportion, but and say all of them are, but they're not. But they are. Some of them are actually quite powerful. And wouldn't it have been easier for balance as well as just development time to have just said, Void Elves like Blood Elves, give them the same basic racials. High Mountain Tauren, all right, you're not swapping faction with them, but they're like Tauren, just give them the same bloody racials, and bloody blah, blah, blah. Dark-Eyed Dwarfs, they're just dwarfs. Because they're just dwarfs, have the same racials, and all the rest of it. There was no reason for them to be anything other than a cosmetic choice. But that's not the way they've gone with them. They've gone with them as an actual... It is a new racial choice. Okay, it's like a hero race because they start at level 20 and all the rest of it. But, they've got the racials attached. Which obviously is going to create concern for anyone who is concerned about racials for what happens when they start putting more allied races in the game. It is going to basically create a racials arms war, is what I fear. So, yeah, I would have just preferred if they were just literally considered sub-races. It says the problem with the bring the player, not the class idea is that it leads to all classes all having to be the same, which I don't agree with. because when classes were the most different, like the most different to each other, was vanilla. And there you basically had to bring the player, not the class. You needed a few of each, like you would want Warlock, because they provided a stamina buff, so you'd put that, you'd want a Warlock at least in the first two groups for your tanks and stuff like that. And you wanted a certain number of Paladins for blessings. But effectively, you could absolutely bring the player, not the class, in most cases, once you'd got the basics in there. And the raids were so large anyway, it was easy to do that. Now, of course, there are differences. I'm not saying they should go back to how it was in vanilla, because, of course, the nature of raiding was different. Like I've just said there, the major raids, at any rate, were all 40-man, so it's easy to get in what you needed in terms of raid-wide buffs and things like that, and then just take whatever you needed in terms of the best or more reliable players. But nonetheless, it does dispel the notion that that bringing the player, not the class, means homogenization of abilities. No, it doesn't. It does mean, however, there is some homogenized, but there's some homogenization now. And what they're moving into with BfA, there's still going to be something that you could call homogenization. It's as simple as that. Because you can have there's certain abilities that are very common in raids. And when those abilities come up, there's certain utility abilities that are needed. So interrupts, for example, well, you need people who can interrupt. You know, there are fights now, there's going to be fights in BfA, where they can have, you're going to need to set up an interrupt rotation. Well, so we're going to all need interrupts, aren't we? Certainly melee are, because they're the ones who are most likely to do the interrupt rotations. So that sort of thing is still going to be there. But there's other bits of utility as well. The reason why class balance is never really achieved in raiding is because they've realised that they need to give everyone interrupts, and melee have to have them on a shortish cooldown. But there's other things that often happen as well, for which some classes have the tools to deal with it and others don't, and they just don't accept that, and that's why you always have this class stacking. You know, Blizzard say they want to move to a situation where you want to have at least one of each class in your raid. Well, that is anathema to class stacking. Anything you put in the game that encourages class stacking is going to do that. But class stacking is always going to be done if you keep putting mechanics in raids that are negated by someone's, you know, ability, a particular ability, whether it be aspect of the turtle or cloak of shadows, or whether it be something else. That's always going to happen. It's always going to happen. And then it says, I agree that currently rogues, affliction locks, and to a lesser extent shadow priests are at the level where raids feel like they need them. But that always has more to do with encounter design than it does with giving classes abilities that are unique. But this is where the thing, you see that the problem is that you have separated those two things, as have Blizzard for many years. They now say they're going to coordinate between the encounter design team and the class design team, which is what they all should have done. The problem is that they're not separate, and you can't treat them separately. My concern is Blizzard are talking about giving responsibility for ensuring this happens to the class design team. But the problem is the class design team, when BfA launches, then it's not that their work is over, but most of it is, if we're honest. It's tuning after that. The abilities are there. You know, they can, as they've done in Legion, they might be able to get away with changing the odd talent or changing the odd ability, but you can't just wholesale change talents and abilities from tier to tier or patch to patch. So effectively their work is done when it goes live, but the work of the encounter design team is not. And the issue there becomes you're making the class design team something responsible for work that's going to take place after they've done their work. You know, that's a bit mad. That is a bit mad. It's a bit like making the builders of a house responsible for the wallpaper that gets put up there. But yeah, so... But they're not separate. They need to be put together. Blizzard have recognised, at long last, that they need to go hand in hand. I just hope that they do that. Because there's any number of things that they'll say which are encouraging, and they've done it in past expansions as well, and then it turns out they haven't followed through on what they said they were going to do. So we have to hope that they will. On to the next one. It says, in terms of, this was the video I did on, was Mythic raiding worth it? Mythic raiding is the main reason I still play because it provides challenge and pride of killing a boss and also gives me reason to still log in. I started Legion with only one goal, to get curve from each boss. I didn't even think about Mythic because I thought I'm not good enough, and I was wrong. But now that I've tried Mythic, doing only Heroic is not enough for me, though I don't like a wall that is getting 19 people from the same realm. I changed realm with my friends because we're on Dreadnought Alliance. And drama that can happen. Well, I mean, a couple of things in this. The first one is absolutely, for me, Mythic raiding is what I play the game for as much as I do. If it disappeared or I couldn't do it, then I would still play it, but I'd play it much more casually, which means I would spend more time playing the other games that I also like to play. For me, raiding is where it's at. There are other good things in the game as well, but are those other good things better than those same things in other game systems? No. I like the leveling content in World of Warcraft, not the early leveling content. I think that's terrible. But each on an expansion by expansion, when you're doing the leveling content that's current for the expansion you're in, I always think that's good. I always think it doesn't age well. So when you're doing the previous content's leveling stuff, that's not a good experience. But the latest one is a good experience, at least for the first 5 or 6 outs. Then, but is it better than in some other games I played? No, it's not. It's actually not as good as in some others. Same with Professions. I quite like the way Professions work. But is it better than other ones? No. And I could go down the list with everything. But when it comes to raiding, is it better than in other games? It's difficult for me to say certainly, but I sort of think in terms of what I've seen, yes. Okay? And that's all there is to me. But then the other point you mentioned as well, I mean, about not thinking you're good enough for it, it's always worth giving it a go. There are people who have the opposite way around. They think they're good enough for Mythic because they've killed a few Mythic bosses, and probably they're not. They're sort of being carried along. I had a good one in LFR yesterday. I was streaming this. I was on my Warlock, and we were doing Coven LFR. It was fairly hideous. It was pretty hideous. Ultimately, what was happening is this guy was dying all the time, this tank. And what happened, there was one bit where I rezzed him. And he accepted the res, and he died again straight away because he rezzed into some crap. But there was loads of crap going on around at the time. It wasn't that I deliberately rezzed him into it, but it doesn't matter. He was saying, how is it possibly his fault that he got rezzed into this thing? I was saying, well, you get a marker where you're being rezzed. You should look at it and check that it's safe. That's your responsibility. And then I said, well, there is also the other issue, that you are dying. I mean, who dies in LFR, seriously? So, unless you've gone in like with weak ass gear. But he hadn't. I looked him up on Wild Progress. It was quite funny. Because he eventually got kicked. He was such an ass. And he had 4 mythic kills. And I thought, well, how the hell does someone die on LFR when they're killing mythic bosses? And I looked them up, and they were a Guardian Druid in this LFR, but that's not what they'd killed the mythic bosses on. They'd killed it as a balanced Druid. But still, so they were playing a spec that they were unfamiliar with. They were obviously also not familiar with the tanking abilities, shall we say. Because you can easily not be. I frequently am not as a DPS. I know the ones that I need to keep alive. To keep myself alive, that is. And that's about it. So if there's a particular tanking mechanic that means it's going to do a cleave, I sort of know not to stand in front of the boss. Not that I'd want to do that anyway. So yeah, I mean, you will get some people who go into Mythic thinking they're good enough and they're not. But you get the other way around. I'm sure there are people, maybe even watching this, that have never tried Mythic, think it's too hard. It is a lot harder. It doesn't mean to say you can't do it. You just need to give it a go. And also accept that if you don't succeed first time, doesn't mean to say you can't succeed. You just have to get, anyone can do it if they're willing to just accept that, failure is a learning process. You try something that doesn't work, you learn from it and you get better. But the final point is one that Blizzard would definitely agree with, and they've said as much. It says, I don't like a wall that is getting 19 people from the same realm and the drama that can happen. Because a lot of people talk about, why should raids give better rewards than, say, Mythic Plus? Because Mythic Plus can now be made very, very challenging. It has effectively infinite challenge. And the reason is, and as Blizzard have said themselves, I mean, from my point of view, my personal opinion is that it's an MMO, right? And a lot of people argue that these days the MMO has largely disappeared from it. It's actually quite funny because, 10 years ago, they were called MMORPGs. Sort of technically still are, but now we just call them MMOs. And it's a bit funny because the RPG elements are always still in there. They've never left. It's the MMO elements that some people query because so much of it can be done as effectively a single player game. Raiding is the one thing that is still making it an MMO for me. For me, what makes it an MMO is not the fact that there could be loads of other people around you. Technically it does. Technically it does. But if there's no interaction with those other people, then to what extent is it an MMO? They could just be, randomly scripted NPCs who would know the difference. If there's no interaction, then they might as well not be players. Raiding is the last big thing where you need a large group to do that. And so raiding should always be the premier content in any MMO. Any MMO, no matter what its focus is, whether it's PvE or PvP. I mean, you can raid in PvP, of course. But that's not Blizzard's take. Blizzard's take is one of raiding is more difficult to organise and larger scale raiding is more difficult to organise. Because you have to organise this roster that will accommodate not only an exact number of 20 people, because the flex mode of normal and heroic, of course, you can go with fewer, you can go with more. You need 20. And you need 20 with a good balance of the right roles as well. And as we really know in reality, classes. Then you've got, as you say, their drama. So you've got the social cohesion aspect. You've got people who need to lead that guild and make sure that people who will be doing it for various different motivations can all, find common purpose. There'll be some people who want to do it so they can pass. There'll be some people who want it for the loot. Some people who just want to do it for the challenge. Various reasons. Making sure that they're all working effectively as a team is, again, a difficult task. And that's the reason why Blizzard say that raiding will always have to give the best rewards, because that management effectively is way in excess of managing anything else, even a Mythic Plus dungeon group, because that tends to be done on a much more ad hoc, friendly basis while still being effective. Last couple, so a couple of short ones to finish off with. The next one, it says, I personally hope there is still time for me to catch up before the next expansion. At this particular point in time, it's the perfect time. If I'm not quite sure the context of this, whether you're talking about you've returned to the game and you want to get a character up, which is something I've experienced of, or you've just joined the game new, or indeed you've been playing the game for a while, but you've only been doing it casually and you want to get into raiding. Now is the perfect time to do any of those. When I took a break, a big break, in Wrath. After the first tier, wasn't happy with it at all, left. Came back for the last tier of Cataclysm, and even before the extent of the content drought was known, I knew that there would be time, because in the last tier, there's always time. Because I thought to myself, I'd like to get back into raiding, but I had a character with no gear. So I was going to take my time to do that, and I knew it would be the perfect time to do it. Learn aspects of the game, do what you can, get into a guild if you can, and really learn your craft. And then for the next expansion, which, when the next expansion is imminent, that's usually a couple of months before that, is a good time to try and find the guild that you want to do the next expansion with. You'll have learned your craft and all the rest of it. So we know that BfA is going to come out at the latest 21st of September. So, you could be arguing it might come out about a month before that, maybe. So you're probably talking late August, sometime in September. So you've got a bit of a thing to aim for. You've got a good half a year to do whatever you need to do in terms of getting yourself into whatever content you need for some experience, and then you should be good to go in the next one. So yeah, it's a fantastic time for someone who wants to change what they do in World of Warcraft, because you've got the time to do it in a nice, relaxed situation. And then the final question, this one came up in the live rec Q&A yesterday, but I'll cover here as well. It says, do you think them reducing Titan forging chances will lower overall participation in Mythic Plus? I don't really. If we split up, the Mythic Plus community into three main categories. I know people don't like being pigeonholed, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm going to split it up into three types of Mythic Plus player. So there's the Mythic Plus player that really wants to push keys and do the really high keys. There's the Mythic Plus player like myself that basically just wants to get their weekly done for the gear from the weekly chest. Every now and then, if some people want to do a Mythic Plus and I'm available, sure, I'm ready for it. And then you've got the Mythic Plus players who are not able to do the highest version of Mythic Plus that awards the best gear. So at the moment, that's a plus 15. So those are the players who push it as hard as they can, but they're never able to quite get the plus 15. Or if they do, that's the very best they can do. They can't do a 16. So into those three groups. So let's look at each group in turn. So the groups that like pushing the keys, whether they want like the Mythic Plus score or just Realm Best or for whatever other reason, those players are not going to be as concerned by the reduced Titanforge change. It's a disappointment to them, but given that that's not their motivation, their main motivation for doing Mythic Plus, then no, it's not going to affect those players at all. The players who do it just to get the weekly cash thing, all right, are they going to stop doing it? No, because you still get a piece of gear, even if it doesn't Titanforge, in your weekly cash, and you only need to do like 1 plus 15 or whatever the highest level is at the time. So those people are still going to be motivated to do it because they're not motivated by the gear that drops in the dungeon itself, but the gear that drops in the weekly cash, which again at the moment has a highish chance of Titanforge. But even before they brought that in, we still did it, even when we didn't expect it to Titanforge. And then the other group of players, the ones who keep pushing but don't quite get the plus 15, they're still going to do it because they know they can get better gear just by pushing a slightly higher key. So they're still going to be motivated to participate as much as they do now, because every extra difficulty they manage, they know they're getting better gear baseline. They're not reliant upon it Titanforging. Okay, so for each of those three groups of player, what I would say is that the reduced chance of Titanforging might be a small disappointment, but because it doesn't really feed into the main motivations for doing it, none of those three groups of player do it in the expectation of getting Titanforge gear, should we say. They might do it in the hope of it, but not in the expectation. So I think all that will actually happen is you might find, like at the moment, I've been talking quite a bit about the fact that some people who do a lot of Mythic Plus will tend to have the best item level gear because they've got so many bites of the cherry at Titanforge gear, and naturally they're likely to have a high item level. Whereas in Rage, you've got much fewer. You can be lucky, but you've got much fewer chances of getting Titanforge gear in a Raid because you don't do them as often. So it might change the balance of item level of players between Mythic Plus and Raids, but I don't think it will affect people's motivation because those are not the main motivations for doing it now. For most people. So I don't expect it to lower participation. And I think also we ought to bear in mind that Blizzard could and probably will still refine and change the reward system for Mythic Plus and the way it works anyway into the next expansion. Just because it's been a big success story in Legion doesn't mean to say that there aren't things they'd still like to change about it. So there we go. That's the mailbox for another week. I'll be back on again next week with one there. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to give it a like. Subscribe if it's the first time to my channel. Check out other videos if it's also the first time to my channel. And until next time, I'll see you later.